This lecture will cover Chapter 15, Evolution and Human Behavior. The application of evolutionary theory to human behavior is very controversial. How many of you think that we can reduce all human behavior down to an evolutionary explanation? Many scholars don't think that we can, and I think it's understandable, but doesn't mean we shouldn't try to do the research. There are some topics that can be easily explained within evolutionary theory. These behaviors include cooperation, incest taboos, and most mating patterns. But what else? What do you think that can be easily explained with this theory? If not all human behavior can be reduced to evolutionary theory, then does that mean that no behaviors can? We're going to take a look at a few examples. First, let's take a moment to ask the question, how can we explain how natural selection shapes human behavior? One approach is to recognize that human behavior is in part a function of our brain. Natural selection has shaped not only the size of our brain, but also our cognitive abilities, including our ability to speak and engage in complex thinking. If behavior is influenced by our brain, then of course natural selection has shaped behavior via our brain. How does behavioral flexibility evolve? Dietary flexibility in the rat provides a nice example of this shaping. Rats quickly learn to avoid foods that make them ill. They will sample a small amount of a new food and then wait several hours. If it makes them ill, then they will avoid this food in the future. If it does not make them ill, however, they will continue to eat it. Rats have evolved dietary flexibility, which allows them to sample the many different types of food in their environment, in part because they live in such a range of different habitats, from grassy fields to subway stations. Rats do not have specific genes that code for proteins that cause them to avoid specific foods. Instead, they have evolved dietary flexibility, which is a good solution to the problems they face in nature. Humans have also evolved behavioral flexibility, and in part because we too evolved in an ever-changing environment. Let's look at the example of inbreeding avoidance and human mate choice. Matings between relatives are known as inbred matings, and the offspring of these matings are much more likely to be homozygous for deleterious recessive alleles. In your book, you've already come across some of these diseases, such as cystic fibrosis and Tay-Sachs disease, and there's many others. These deleterious alleles exist in very low frequencies in the population and are usually hidden by the dominant alleles in heterozygous individuals, making the individuals carrying them phenotypically normal. However, there are enough diseases in existence that geneticists estimate that each person carries between 2 and 5 alleles for fatal diseases. Any two random individuals who become mates are unlikely to share those same 2 to 5 deleterious alleles. However, close relatives are likely to carry alleles for the same diseases. This means that inbreeding increases the likelihood of combining 2 heterozygous individuals for the same disease, making inbreeding a behavior that would decrease one's fitness. Natural selection should therefore favor behavioral adaptations that reduce the tendency for humans to want to engage in inbreeding. But inbreeding avoidance is beneficial not just in humans but in all animals. So how do other animals avoid inbreeding? When primates reach sexual maturity, members of one or both sexes leave their group and join another group. In chimpanzees, the females tend to leave their natal group and join another group. This behavior reduces the likelihood that a primate will mate with a close relative, since close relatives leave the natal group. However, even in cases where related males and females remain in close contact with one another, matings are rare. Inbreeding avoidance happens not just in chimpanzees, but in humans as well. In the early part of the last century, hundreds of cultural anthropologists studied the lives of different cultures all around the world. What was reported was a tremendous range in how humans live and behave. People ate different things, lived in different structures, and spoke a variety of different languages. Some cultures were polygynous, some were monogamous, and some were polyandrous. In some places, descent is followed through the female lineage and others the male lineage. But there are universal things found in all these cultures. One such example is inbreeding avoidance. There's not a single culture in the world in which brothers and sisters mate with each other, though there's considerable variation in the marriage rules around the world concerning cousins as well as nieces and nephews. It probably is not surprising that humans avoid close inbreeding, since our primate relatives avoid inbreeding as well. We've inherited from our primate ancestors a psychological mechanism that limits sexual attraction to close relatives. So what is this psychological mechanism, and why does the idea of inbreeding feel so wrong to us? In the late 19th century, a sociologist by the name of Edward Westermarck proposed the idea that incest avoidance develops when children live in close proximity to one another, whether they're related to one another or not. As adults, these individuals who grew up together are not sexually attracted to each other. Many lines of evidence now suggest that this is in fact how inbreeding avoidance develops, and it's known as the Westermarck effect. Let's look at the evidence. Until recently, some areas of China practiced what are called minor marriages. In these cultures, brides-to-be were adopted into the family of their future husband when they were very young children, sometimes just babies. The future husband and wife grew up essentially as brother and sister. What resulted was sexual disinterest. In the graph on the left is the fertility rate along the y-axis and the wife's age at adoption across the x-axis. Notice that the younger the wife when she was adopted, the less fertile the couple is. Girls who were older than 9 years old when they were adopted into their husband's family had higher fertility rates. On the right is a graph showing that the likelihood that these relationships end in divorce. Notice that girls adopted into their husband's family after the age of 10 had only slightly higher rates of divorce than the general public. However, those adopted into the family as infants had a much higher likelihood of divorce. Children who grew up under the same roof were not attracted to each other as adults. There are other examples of the Westermarck effect. For instance, before World War II, Jewish immigrants to Israel organized themselves in communities called kibbutzim. Unrelated children were raised in nurseries together and lived in small, intimate groups. Though they were not discouraged from sexual experimentation or eventual marriage, this rarely happened. In fact, data from 2,769 marriages showed that only 14 were between individuals from the same kibbutz. Again, individuals who are raised in close contact, whether they were related or not, develop a sexual aversion to each other. So whom do we choose to mate with and why? Shortly after returning from his voyage on the HMS Beagle, a 29-year-old Charles Darwin made a list of pros and cons of whether or not he should marry Emma Wedgwood, who was his cousin. He did marry her, and they had 10 children together. But the story is not an unusual one. Everyone everywhere struggles with these kinds of decisions. People everywhere care about the kind of person they will marry. However, the choice of whom we decide to marry eventually is not entirely random, and evolutionary theory makes some predictions about human mate preferences. Remember from earlier chapters that the factor limiting reproductive success in females, no matter the species, is adequate access to resources. Thus, we might expect that females would be attracted to males who could provide access to resources. The factor limiting reproductive success in males is access to fertile females. Because human female fertility is highest in their 20s, one might expect that males would be attracted to young, healthy females. As is shown in the figure on the slide, female fertility is the highest between ages 20 and 30 and drops as a female approaches menopause around the age 50. Male fertility peaks between 30 and 40. Pre-industrial societies did not carry IDs, so youth had to be gauged by other means, such as smooth skin, shiny hair, and good muscle tone. Furthermore, human children are dependent on their parents for a very long period of time. Thus, it would be expected that human males and females would look for mates that they could get along with for many years. Of course, if evolution has shaped human mating strategies, then we should find these patterns across all the different cultures around the globe. This, in fact, is the case. Around the globe, in all sorts of different societies, male and female show similar patterns of what they look for in a mate. This study was conducted with people in 33 different countries, and the qualities listed in the table are on this slide. So men and women both rate mutual attraction and love above all else, and then look for certain personal attributes like dependability and maturity. It's interesting to note that there are some subtle differences in how men and women rank traits, and these differences fit into what we would predict according to evolutionary theory. As we've already mentioned, the limiting factor for female reproductive success is access to adequate resources, and the limiting factor for male reproductive success is access to fertile females. According to evolutionary theory, natural selection should favor females who are attracted to males who can provide these resources, whereas males should be attracted to fertile females. In humans, this partially plays out in age preferences. Men tend to prefer women who are younger than they are, and therefore will have more offspring over a longer period of time with them. Women tend to prefer men who are older than they are, perhaps in part because in many human cultures, resources will often accumulate over one's lifetime. The graphs on this slide illustrate this trend in data collected from humans from different populations, including the Philippines, United States, Northern Europe, and India. The top graph shows a man's preference at different stages of his life. Early in a man's reproductive years, he does not seem to care as much about the age difference between himself and his female partner. However, as a man ages, he prefers a woman increasingly younger than himself. Females, regardless of their stage in life, tend to prefer a man 10 years older. In addition to looking for different qualities and even different ages in the mates we choose, human men and women differ in their mating tactics. Women invest heavily in their offspring. They grow them for a 40-week gestation and then continue to nurse them for up to 3 years, after which time children are still really dependent on mothers for years. Selection would therefore favor women who are very picky and cautious about the men they choose to have sex with. Given the energy needed to raise a child, women should be more likely to have sex with a man if they are currently in a stable long-term relationship with that person. Let's look at how this played out in different societies. Men are less selective about their mates, and they're willing to accept more diversity in the number of mates that they have. So university students from 62 countries were asked how many sex partners they would like to have over the course of the next month, 6 months, year, and upward to 30 years. On average, men preferred to have many more partners than women. In the next year, for example, the average male would prefer 3 partners, though some preferred up to 10. The average woman preferred 1 partner, with some preferring up to 3. This trend continued regardless of the time interval and is the same regardless of the culture being studied. Although these cross-cultural studies reveal that men and women look for many of the same qualities in a mate regardless of where in the world they live, these same studies have demonstrated that culture can have an enormous impact on mate choice as well. The characteristic that varied the most from the cross-cultural study at the very beginning of the lecture was chastity. The relative importance of chastity is graphed on the top of this slide on a scale of 0, which is irrelevant, to 3, which is indispensable, with some cultures ranking chastity very low and others ranking it very high. There's not much of a pattern with regards to sex, though men do seem to find chastity a bit more important than women in 5 of the 7 populations listed here.